So, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Ernie Bell and his sister Winnie Payne. They're residents of Newport, Oregon. And Ernie and Winnie were living in Berkeley, California when their father got a job working in one of the 10 incarceration camps for Japanese Americans in 1942. So their family moved to Topaz, Utah, and they lived in the camp with the Japanese American incarcerated people. They attended school. Ernie was in the sixth grade. Winnie was in the 4th grade. And they lived in the camp with the people, attended school, went to community events, and made some lifelong friends from the experience. So they're here today to share that experience, talk to us about it, and let's give them a welcome.
Well, our game plan for today is that I'll start out and use the outline that you may have found on your tables, the listing of events. I think there are about 16 different events relating to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And then Winnie's going to take over and she'll describe some of her experiences and reflections about our time at Topaz. So, let's begin. List some of these events of the incarceration. Keep in mind how the government went step by step by step. First, just asking people to record their names. And then the next step, and then the next step. Keep that in mind because such things are going on right now in our government and in our understanding of immigration and of Muslims who live in the United States. During World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned at concentration camps in the United States. They're called concentration camps because they concentrated, not everybody, just Japanese ancestry people. The fear was that if the Japanese invaded the west coast of America, they would be loyal to Japan rather than the United States. By war's end, there was not one single case of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans. As Betty said, we lived in Berkeley then, and sometimes the air raid sirens would sound, and the blackout regulations would take effect. Wardens would go from block to block looking for any bits of light coming through the screened windows. When our family heard the sirens, we followed our family plan. We turned off the natural gas line. We doused all the lights, moved to the basement where all the windows were blacked out, and we had a spot in the corner where we could listen to the radio and wait for an imminent attack. We never knew if the sirens signaled a practice drill or if it was for real. Finally, the all clear signal would sound and we were free to resume our normal activity. Paragraph 2, on December 7th, 1941, just hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded up 1,291 Japanese community and religious leaders, arresting them without evidence and freezing their assets. The fate of Japanese Americans in California, Oregon, and Washington was in a state of great agitation and fear. They were often accused of being security risks, and wild rumors circulated about Japanese Americans being engaged in espionage. The FBI had immediately arrested Japanese Americans who had had some connection with Japan. Some 800 fishermen who lived on Terminal Island in the Los Angeles harbor were arrested within a week, and their boats were confiscated. Many of the wives and families were left without a breadwinner, and they had no idea where their husbands had been taken. Paragraph 3, in January of 1942, enemy aliens, that is, subjects or citizens of Japan, Germany, or Italy, in the United States were required to register with the Department of Justice. Their children who were born in the United States and thereby were American citizens were called, euphemistically, non-aliens. Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. Authorized the military to exclude any persons from military areas without any trials or hearings, and this was later confirmed by the U.S. Congress. Beginning in March of 1942, orders to evacuate were posted in Japanese American communities, allowing only a few days' notice. They were to report to a location with no more luggage than they could carry. Each family was given a number. Tags were attached to each person and each item of luggage. In her book, Looking Like the Enemy, Mary Matsuda Greenwald describes the day her family was evacuated from Bainbridge Island near Seattle. She was 17 years old and was a junior in high school. She writes, "Mama put on her hat, something she did only when going somewhere special. Instead of slacks and a shirt, she wore a pretty navy blue dress with a white crocheted collar, along with hosiery and dress shoes. She carried a coat and purse. Papa wore his navy blue suit, his white shirt, dress shoes, and hat. We were startled to see covered army trucks lined up along the street. Soldiers stood at attention with rifles and fixed bayonets. We all stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Are we going to be treated as prisoners of war and executed?" Papa set his suitcases down without taking his eye off the trucks. His eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. "Army truck," he mentioned. His shoulders slumped. Under his breath, I heard him whisper, "I wonder what this means." This was the first time I ever saw my father broken. Seeing him defeated terrified me. A soldier gave us tags and our family number, 19788. He looked at each of us and said, "Be sure to put that number on these tags and put them on each piece of luggage. You'll be identified as members of the same family, so be sure to put it on your coat where we can see it." I had become a number, counted and labeled as the enemy. More families arrived. At the sight of the armed soldiers, they all looked frightened and whispered to each other. The children fell silent, huddling close to their parents. The adults were tight-lipped, their eyes darting from soldiers to the guns to the line of army trucks nearby. I stood close to Mama and found comfort in our shared silence. We had no idea where we were going that fateful day as we waited. I did not know what the bigger picture was, and I didn't know if the government did either. All I knew was that all of us of Japanese descent would be affected. Now, do you have any questions at this point?
Yes. Did they ever get their property back?
There's, with each family, probably a different story. Some people own property, and they sold it quickly, as quickly as they could, when they knew that they were going to be removed from that territory. Others had neighbors who they were friends, and they said, we'll take care of your property while you're gone. Some did and some didn't. Other people decided never to go back to their California, Oregon, Washington homesteads or property. They settled elsewhere in the United States. So there's a whole variety of answers to that question. Others?
How did the government know to round up the Japanese so quickly after Pearl Harbor?
Of 1940 and 41 were times of tension, because in Europe, Germany and Italy had had great success in overcoming countries, and the United States was very concerned that if war should break out, they wanted to be prepared. How they knew anything about Japanese threat, I do not know, except Japan had entered Manchuria and conquered that country, and perhaps they said the threat is also on the Pacific. But they were prepared at Pearl Harbor to make those arrests. Yes?
Do you know of people or groups of Japanese Americans who resisted? And if they resisted, what happened to them?
One was a test case for the Supreme Court. His name was Minoru Yasui, was one who tested the curfew. A curfew was imposed upon Japanese Americans from 8 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. Minoru Yasui was a law student at University of Oregon, graduated, and then went to Portland to set up a law practice. And he said, I'm going to test that curfew. I'm a citizen of the United States. I was born in Hood River, Oregon. And so he went out on the streets waiting to be arrested. But nobody paid any attention to him, so he went into the police department and said, I demand to be arrested. And the officer said, go back home. But his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he lost that case because the Supreme Court said during war, some of our civil rights have to be set aside because of that war involvement. Yes?
So that means that just they were afraid of some kind of espionage that might happen just on the West Coast. So just the West Coast Asians were incarcerated?
And yes, and the persons in the other part of the United States were not affected at all. Okay, let's pick up a little bit about what happened immediately after people were ordered to go to the street corner and wait for trucks, buses, sometimes trains to take them to the next place. There were 16 temporary, they were called assembly centers, hastily prepared for housing in fairgrounds, racetracks, and exhibition buildings. Santa Anita and Tanforan racetracks in California housed many of the Japanese Americans that were at Topaz. Some lived in whitewashed horse stables, while others were assigned hastily built barracks. This was to be their home for some 6 months until the more permanent concentration camps were constructed. Those in Oregon, some 3,676 people of Japanese descent, were confined in the hastily converted animal corrals at Portland's International Livestock Exposition Center. That building still is in existence. It's called the Expo Center. They all lived under one roof in cots lined up all over the place. More than 2/3 of the incarcerated Japanese Americans were born in the United States and were therefore U.S. citizens. Many had never been to Japan. They were known as Nisei, the children of the Issei, who were the immigrants to the United States. There were 10 Japanese concentration camps in the United States located in remote areas of California, Idaho, Utah, Arkansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and Arizona. And our family, the Bell family, lived at Topaz, Utah, about 100 miles south of Salt Lake City. The camps were located in inhospitable areas that were often too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. A family was assigned one room with a cot and bedding for each member. That's it. A pot-bellied stove was in the corner. Each block of 12 barracks housed about 200 persons, had a dining hall, men's and women's latrines and shower rooms, and a central laundry room. And here I'd like to show Ernie's PowerPoint. 31 square miles in central Utah. And the square with the X in it was Topaz. That's where everybody lived. The surrounding area was farmland and desert. And some of the farmland was acquired by eminent domain by the U.S. government to provide crops that could be providing food for the people in the project, in the center. In fact, our father was an agriculturalist, and so he was to manage the farm. We'll hear more about his experiences with that when Winnie describes some of the farm quality. The second PowerPoint is a picture of the 1 mile square. City of Topaz was basically 32 blocks of residences and several blocks, some for schools, some for recreation, some for fire breaks. And in the northern part was the hospital. Do you see that's right under the main gate? And then there was the administration, and then to the left of that was housing for the administration. That meant the non-Japanese persons like my dad who had jobs working in administration. And then the hospital, and then in the corner was the military police barracks. And they were outside the wire fence that surrounded the rest of the city. And do you see on the corners and in the midway points are the sentry towers? And those were manned by military police who were armed and could warn people not to get too close to the fence. We had one situation where an elderly man was shot and killed because he didn't seem to be aware that he was getting too close to the fence, and he may not have heard the warnings of the sentry. The question is, was the person that was murdered at Topaz or shot and killed by the sentry, was the family ever compensated? The answer is no. And I think he was a single person, so whether he had an intact family, I don't know. The sentry that shot him was put on court-martial, but acquitted of any wrong action. But that was one of the crises at Topaz, because the persons thought, is the penalty for getting too close to the fence death? This is the last of a PowerPoint. This shows a typical block with 12 barracks, and in the lower center part the dining hall and the kitchen where the food was prepared. And in that H-shaped building was the latrines for the men and for the women, the shower rooms, and the laundry rooms. There's a pile of coal that people could go to and get a supply of coal for their pot-bellied stoves in their so-called apartments. There were 6 apartments in one barrack. The smallest one was 20 feet by 16. The largest one was 24 feet by 20 feet. And the middle one was 20 feet squared.
Did they have to purchase that stuff or?
For the answer is no. They had food supplied 3 times a day at the dining hall, and then they could live in these apartments. That's where they had only a cot and blankets, and so they had to create furniture. They had scrap lumber from the camp that could be fashioned into tables and chairs and other things to make it more like home. But that was entirely up to the people living there. Some people got jobs at the center. They were cooks, worked on the farm, did a variety of different office work and so forth. They were teachers in the schools, and they were given a very small pay per month. And they could use that pay to buy stuff at the co-op or to order things from Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck. The question is, was it voluntary that they worked? And the answer is yes. They weren't required to work, but they could if they wanted to earn a little bit of money. And so most of them, especially the younger people, the older people, the Issei, the original immigrants, they were getting up in years, and some couldn't work or didn't want to work. And so they found ways to spend their time other than going to a job. Yes, Rhonda?
Was that like $1 a day? Did I read $1 a day or something for that?
There were 3 levels of pay. If they were professionals, they got $19 a month.
A month.
That means doctors, teachers, so forth. If they were common laborers, they got $12 a month. If they were in between, sort of with certain skills, it was $16 a month. The reason they set that $19 as the maximum, that was what a buck private in the Army received. And they didn't want any Japanese Americans making more than a buck private.
That's where I got the buck.
Number 10. Gradually, the camp residents were allowed to get clearance to leave the camp. First, college students were accepted in Eastern and Midwestern universities. Not every university, not every college, but some that thought, let's give these college students a chance to continue their education. Men could sign up to help harvest crops in nearby farms. I noticed one of the panels said the sugar beet people, farmers in Eastern Oregon, were very concerned that they have a labor force to harvest their beets. 11. Finally, the war drew to a close. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that individuals who were considered loyal citizens could not be prevented from living anywhere they chose, including the homes where they had before the war. Number 12, Japanese Americans had served in the Army, having enlisted or being drafted. When war was declared, many were discharged immediately, sent home. I think someone in positions of leadership said, what are all these young men doing in these camps? They could be soldiers. And so they were allowed to volunteer. And then even later, they were drafted back into the Army as the war continued. Here I want to talk a little bit about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They set up a separate regimental combat team that was only Japanese Americans with their non-Japanese officers. 3 units were eventually mobilized: the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. The infantry units trained at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where race was a constant issue for the young soldiers. Officers told the men they were to be considered white, to use white drinking fountains and white bathrooms, and to sit in the front of the bus. The units adopted the slogan, "Go for broke," which crap shooters, I understand, cry when they want to bet everything they have and shoot the works. On August 21st of 1943, the first unit joined a convoy heading for North Africa and the fighting in Europe. The Japanese American units were involved in heavy fighting in Italy, France, and Germany, and wondered if sometimes they were assigned suicide missions. If they were being used as cannon fodder, no worry, we'll go for broke. In time, the 442nd became, for its size and length of service, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. The question was, how were the residents of Topaz treated by the military? And there were signs of discrimination and harassment, like a truckload of workers going out to the agricultural fields. You have to dismount each person and look at their pass individually and then load back up before you could go out to the field. There were others that were treated fairly, so it's a mixed bag. Other questions? Yes. The question is something about what were some of the legal rationales for the internment. And I don't have a definitive answer, but the attitudes of the military decision makers affected how these decisions were made. But justification, it was all had to do with the war effort and military necessities. Because some of the Army personnel that were in charge of this decision making, one was quoted as saying, if they have just 1/16 Japanese blood, they're a Jap, and they should go to the camps. And they had an orphanage in one of the camps where they took care of some 60 children who were orphans or foster children. Yes, the question is, how about the Germans and the Italian Americans? Were they treated differently because they were white rather than being able to look different than the Japanese Americans? As far as German American citizens and Italian American citizens, as far as I know, none of them went to internment camps.
At all.
Okay, this person is relating a story about a German American who was born in the United States and served in the Army as a translator.
That's right, but they weren't interned, he suffered discrimination and fear of what might happen with him.
Number 14, the last Japanese internment camp was closed in early 1946. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed by President Reagan 30 years ago, last week, August 10th. President Reagan said, "Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. 3 years later, on September 27th, 1992, President Herbert Walker Bush signed the bill that provided for the payment of reparations. No monetary payments can ever fully compensate loyal Japanese Americans for one of the darkest incidents in American constitutional history. We must do everything possible to ensure that such a grave wrong is never repeated. Well, thank you. The person is asking, what about our personal relationships with schoolmates and so forth? And that's a perfect introduction to Winnie. That's what she does.
We got there in early September, and most of the buildings were not completed, but school was going to start, and that was in early October, I believe. And the first day of registration, I was starting the 4th grade. I went to Block 8, where Mountain View Elementary School was, to register. I went in the door, and the room was bare, except benches around the walls and this pot-bellied stove and a small table and chairs for the teacher. I was sitting there feeling very alone when all these Japanese children were there. They all looked alike to me because I'd never seen so many all together. And I was sitting by myself feeling very out of place when this little girl came up to me and she said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I've never seen so many Japs in my life." That was Hoshiko Hidakawa. She was my best friend. There were no supplies for the teacher to use. They had to really be ingenious to teach us. But we went by California standards and got a good education. Sooner or later we had blackboards, and we had more books than just a few. We wrote compositions, and when I went to a reunion in San Francisco in 1988, I was surprised to read one of my compositions on the blackboard that they had, and my teacher, Florence Date Smith, was there. So it was very nice. We had Japanese American teachers sometimes, and sometimes Hakujin ones. And the sliding windows on the barracks let the sand come in when we were having a dust storm or a snowstorm. And we all huddled around the pot-bellied stove, which burned coal. Most of the people from California never burned coal, so that was an education too. We made good friends that lasted forever. The older kids later on got chances to play sports, football and basketball, with the neighboring towns, maybe baseball too, I don't know. One important place for everyone to have as a center of time and effort is the art school. First started in Tanforan, the racing track, by Mr. Obata, and he knew that people needed something to do. So you could go and learn how to arrange flowers, paint, draw, and it was a good thing to have some kind of normalcy. We found out that the people could make beauty out of nothing. There wasn't even sagebrush growing there, mostly greasewood and rabbit brush. And they'd take these sticks and make artificial flowers and the most beautiful arrangements. Frequently, there were only 3 flowers for heaven, earth, and man, and then foliage in there. They could make all kinds of things out of nothing. They had classes for the adults in flower arranging, English, sewing, lapidary work, accounting, cooking, shell pins and crafts, and business and other things too. I remember Easter sunrise service. There was a stark, empty cross on a vacant lot and no foliage growing. And then on Easter Sunday, somebody had put the most beautiful artificial lilies all up that cross, and it was the most beautiful thing that you ever saw with the rising sun. Later on, they could get passes to the mountains, and they'd go in cattle trucks with a bushel basket and get a bushel basket of good soil so they could grow something, because they couldn't grow anything on the soil at Topaz. And we went to the Protestant church there, and the first time we went, Mom asked one of the ladies, "Is it all right if we come?" And her name was Amy Kajawara, and she said, "Mrs. Bell, the church is for everyone." There was a big agriculture program that our dad was involved in. The soil was very poor. They found out that 70% of the soil was not farmable. It was so bad. 30% they could leach out the salts and put in salt grass and get some kind of crops sooner or later. By the third summer, they raised most of their vegetables for the dining rooms. They had enough food, but the Issei were all used to having Oriental food available, which wasn't available there until one of the ag workers showed initiative and started a bean sprout growing part, and also they made tofu, which helped the seniors a lot. There was a lot of difficulty getting lumber. It wasn't available, and they needed lumber for building hog houses and poultry houses. And so they were able to get scrap lumber by the big truck from a military base near Salt Lake. And it had some 2x4s, but they were only either 2 feet long or 4 feet long. So they would splice them and do what they could. They'd make 4x4s out of 2x4s by using those short pieces. And one University of California graduate learned how to make adobe bricks from the literature. So they made adobe bricks to make the poultry houses. So they had to show a lot of ingenuity. They had trouble getting tools, and they found out the hardware store in Ely, Nevada was going out of business, so they bought everything in a store. And they always had trouble getting enough tools.
You were not allowed into the living quarters?
Yeah, we had the wrong color hair and skin.
And nobody talked to you about that, your friends?
I don't know that we really asked that question. We were kids. You know, kids do dumb things.
Yeah, no, I get it. And any feedback about the quality or quantity of the food?
On the story, this guy said he was a Nisei, young adult, probably in his early 20s, said, "Fish, fish, fish. I want hamburgers." Yeah, I don't know where the fish came from. Maybe it was canned or frozen or something, but that was his complaint. And they had a lot of vegetable crops. Daikon was the white radish that they really like in Japan. They grew that, and one time they tried tomatoes, but the growing season was too short between frosts, so the tomatoes didn't do real well. But they tried to have as many of the vegetable crops as they could
Correct.
before the crops were in and ready to go to replenish the food supply. They ordered food from wherever they could, and it's shipped in by train or by truck, I'm not sure which.
We didn't eat in the dining room. We were a family of 6, and we couldn't afford, Hakajeans had to pay for their meals. And so they got an old wood range, and Mom, it had 3 legs, and Mom cooked on that, and they got a picnic table from somewhere, and we'd carry our dishes over to the laundry room and do dishes afterwards in a bucket, I remember. And so we didn't know what they ate in the dining rooms too much. I think our older brother ate in a dining room once with a friend, and then he was told he wasn't supposed to.
Each block had their own dining hall and their own set of cooks that were employed by the project to do the cooking. Sometimes they were skilled in cooking Japanese food. And sometimes they were skilled in cooking American food. And so the quality varied in every block, had a different kind of food service. And so some of the youth, probably high school and junior high age, would go to the best dining hall that served the kind of food they liked. When I was in junior high, eventually I knew every student in our class. There were about 30 kids, boys and girls in our class, and we were like human beings. But I was aware that I was of white privilege. The word Hakujin means white person. And it seemed like I was never quite treated as all the others were. There's sort of a reserve there. And later on, I think of this privilege of being white. I certainly felt that. And my dad was one of the administration that no doubt had some kind of effect on my peers.
But all of our friends were Japanese Americans. There were a few white kids, we knew them, but our closest friends were the Japanese Americans that were in our class. They needed a lot of workers to do all this work, raising these animals. So they decided that they would use it as a training program for possible employment in the future. And that was a good way to look at it, and it got a lot of people that were interested in farming. So that worked well, and they found it worked so well, they also used it in the motor pool, the shops, so they could teach people on the job too. People worked in the camps, they worked in the dining halls and maintenance. And somebody got up early and built fires in all the washrooms, because when I went over to take my showers, it was colder than heck in there, but there was a wood stove going. So you know, somebody had to get up early and build that coal fire. In fact, Dad had the second secretary who wanted to work for him, and he said, well, I don't have a typewriter. And she says, I have one, I'll bring mine. And at the hospital, they needed aides, and they trained people for that. Also, later on, they got passes and worked for the local farmers. And they had to show their passes going in and going out, but all the passes looked the same. Color of hair, black, color of eyes, brown. I don't know, and there was no picture on there. The people were very stoic. They never complained to us at all. They seemed to make the best of things. And Dad noticed in his report afterwards that they always had an optimistic spirit. That's amazing, because they lost everything. They lost property, a lot of them. They lost family keepsakes because they were from Japan, and that was suspect. They lost their friends at home and their reputations. They stayed in a state of strong loyalty to the United States. many joined in fighting for America. And Ernie already said about the 442nd and 100th Battalion. They bravely fought in Africa and Italy. And they are amazing people. I have a great deal of respect for how they did it. I'm afraid I would have been there.
When they were in the camp, did they know what was going on back with their property? And that's a mixed question. Some did and some didn't. Some had correspondence with that neighbor who said, I'll take care of your strawberry harvest. And they'd keep in touch, and he would set aside some of the money that was received for the crop in their account, in their bank account. Others had no idea whether they would find their property intact, whether their belongings would be ransacked, whether their house would be burned. They could only find that out after they returned.
With us.
Now that was very important because they needed to have a sponsor where they were going. It could be a friend or a relative who would vouch for their honesty and integrity and help them get settled in a new situation. She has heard stories of people who had lost everything. They had nothing to go back to. It was reported that some persons after World War II had no idea what they were going to do, and they committed suicide or drank gasoline. Some of you have read the book Stubborn Twig about the Yasui family of Hood River, and the Issei person, the head of the household, ended up committing suicide in his old age. They don't know if he had dementia or what it was, but that was how he ended his life after World War II. No, my dad worked for a federal agency called the Bureau of Agriculture Economics. And their job was to collect statistics about crops, find the economy of various crops in California. And that was declared not part of the war effort when World War II began. And that office was closed, and that's why my dad was looking for a new job. My mom, pretty much a homemaker in Berkeley, and it was only when we went to Topaz that she started branching out and working for the USO. They had an active USO to give support to the families whose children were whose young men were servicemen. And the servicemen would come back to the camp. They had to get a pass to go into the Topaz to visit their relatives. They had to show the soldiers on guard their pass. I mean, it was just one of the incongruities of that experience.
It changed our lives, really. It was such an experience that you couldn't put into words, and that it influenced the rest of our lives and how we behaved with others. And you found out that you could learn a lot if you just listened to somebody else and quit talking sometimes.
Yeah, one thing that affected me is how I felt as a minority. I was the only one in my class with blue eyes and light brown hair. And guess what? I was the tallest one in the class. And so now when I see a person in a minority situation, I have a certain kinship. And I try to think, what could I say or what could I do to maybe help that person feel more a part of what's going on. They were called evacuees. That seemed to be the name that was given to those who were not part of the Caucasian administration. They had the administration and the evacuees. Well, no one knew, administrators, government, the president, no one knew what would happen after the war. And so all throughout the war experience at Topaz, there were no reassurances. Relocating to the East Coast, to Chicago, New York, wherever they could find a position and move their families there. They were on a whole new destiny. They had sort of given up on the idea of going back. Ultimately, some did leave their jobs in the East Coast and come back to California after the war. But there were no reassurances. The question was, how many persons, Japanese Americans, were in the camp? It was around 8,000.
Wow.
The largest camp was Tule Lake, 15,000 people. The question was, were the apartments crowded? When you have 4 people in a 20 by 20 foot room
That's correct.
and 4 beds,
Wow.
it's getting crowded already. And then if you set up a little closet area, maybe a little table to put things on, chairs, it was pretty crowded in those rooms. Well, the 20 by 20 was probably 3 or 4. If they had large families, 5 or 6, maybe they'd get 24 feet by 20 foot apartment. If they had a very large family, maybe 7 or 8 children, they would have maybe 2 apartments assigned to them. The Bell family had a whole half a barracks for our 6 family of 6. So we were privileged in that respect as well.
It wasn't uncommon for the father to be in the import business, so he was taken right away to be in a different camp, and it was more strict. And most of those never reunited till after the war.
My observation was the families were kept intact as much as possible, even though maybe the father was incarcerated in a different camp, as Winnie was just saying. Okay, this comment that's been made is about those persons that were trying to speak in favor of the Japanese Americans, like in the book Snow Falling on Cedars.
Yeah.
The editor of the local paper was trying to bolster the status of the Japanese Americans, and I think our displays speak to that, how that small minority of people who are trying to give support to the Japanese Americans and speak out in favor of their loyalty and their honesty and integrity were sometimes victims of persecution themselves. Every paper tomorrow will have an editorial on
Free press.
on the free press
Yes.
of
friend.
disavowing fake news.
Correct.
Okay.
When they were tearing down Tule Lake Camp, some workman saw that beautiful thing on a wall of an apartment, and he had the forethought to save it. And we found it in a second-hand store in Klamath Falls, and brought it home, and it is crumbling at the bottom. It's just on wallboard, on the sheetrock. And it was crumbling on the bottom, so we had it framed so it wouldn't fall apart further. But I think the expression on our face is so sad. I think it showed how the people felt inside. They never said anything, but that must have been how a lot of the people felt during this experience. But I think she's beautiful.
Yes.
Some of the Yisei would go out on the desert and they'd find tiny shells that were left over from the Lake Bonneville. Lake Bonneville covered a lot of Utah, including the area around Topaz. So these tiny little clam shells, I don't know what kind of animals they were, but they left their shells on this desert. They would collect the shells, come back and make little figures and flowers out of these shells. And you'll see those up here on this table. We also have some books that we have discovered over time, 2 of which were published by our parents. My mom wrote her memories of Topaz, and my dad talked about the work that he did at Topaz. These on the tables are the Topaz Times. It was a 3 times a week newspaper, and you probably find some headlines that you don't quite understand. We'd try to answer those if we could. Also, there's some copies from our family album, pictures of various things, the agriculture program, as Wendy described. And if you have any questions about these items as well, we'll try to answer them.
And there's a photo album of my class pictures and the kids that I went to school with, and then 2 reunions afterwards. And also a memorial in Klamath Falls for 11 graves that were unmarked. 10 were babies, and 1 was an older gentleman, and they had a ceremony where they put headstones and had quite a ceremony with the big drum and the 1,000 paper cranes, and it was very meaningful. They had a pastor that was from the Methodist Church that was Japanese American, and also a Buddhist priest there, and we have pictures of all of those.
I also brought 2 of the high school yearbooks, 1944 and 1945. And my older brother, Paul, was a social person. I was an introvert, and always in the shadow of my older brother, Paul, who was vice president of the student body one year, who was on the social committee, who was this and who was that. And I just sort of stayed in my room and did my homework.
Yeah.
Tell us about this painting, please.
Oh yeah, the other picture is by Mr. Mikami, a well-known artist there in Topaz, and he depicts a dust storm sweeping through the Topaz area. The big water tower in the back is where water supply was given the pressure to work on the pipes. Trouble is, the pipes were affected by the alkali soil, and they soon started leaking, so they were always repairing the pipes. One of my brother's friends, my older brother Paul, one of his friends told the experience of one time he decided to go with a friend outside the fence at night, climb the water tower, and see Topaz from the top of the tower. So I suppose there is a lot of that stuff going on that we will never know about. Yes, the question is, how about the social circles of our parents? The main social circle were the other Hakujin administration people, the teachers, the administrators of various departments. And so they'd get together for potlucks and for social activities for the family and for themselves. And there was the relationship with the persons in the camp were more having to do with my mother's involvement at the USO and music. Somebody, especially one of the high school kids, needed a pianist to accompany a musical presentation. They'd say, "Mrs. Bell, could you play the piano while I sing?" She'd say, "Why, sure." There's also a band. One of the pictures that you have there is a jazz band where internees, high school kids who got music together, and sometimes my mom would give them support. My mom was also a pianist for a presentation by a high school choir of the Alleluia Chorus, and so we have a picture of that event as well. There was an interesting need. Evacuees were not allowed to have their cars. They either had to store their cars or sell their cars. And so when they came to camp, they had no transportation. When there was a death at Topaz, the nearest mortuary was in Delta, which was 16 miles away, and where they could have the they usually were cremated. In fact, I think 100% of the people who died at Topaz of old age or infirmity were cremated, and the service was either held at Topaz or in Delta at the mortuary. When there was a funeral at the mortuary, they needed cars to transport the next of kin, the relatives, to the mortuary and back. And so my mom agreed to volunteer to provide that service. So she would pick up the people, drive them to Delta, and after the service, bring them back to camp. Those are some of the social connections with my parents.